The carriage wheels stopped turning, and Evelina Marsh stepped down into mud that reached her ankles. Rain fell in thin, cold lines across a sky the color of ash. In front of her stood a house with a broken roof, shattered windows, and ivy that had swallowed half of the stone walls. This was Thornfield Estate. This was her new home, and it looked like nothing more than a grave for a house that had already died. Behind her, the driver did not wait to help with her bags. He dropped them in the mud and turned the carriage around before she could say a word. He wanted to leave as quickly as possible, as if the estate itself carried some kind of curse. Evelina watched the carriage disappear down the long, broken road, and then she turned back to face the ruin that was now hers. 3 days earlier, she had stood in the grand hall of Ashworth Manor, listening to her husband speak to her as though she were a stranger who had wandered into his home by mistake. Duke Julian Ashworth had not raised his voice. He never needed to. His voice was calm, cold, and final, the voice of a man who had already decided everything before the conversation began. "You will live at Thornfield," he had said, not looking up from the papers on his desk. "It is far enough from here that I will not need to think of you. The staff there will manage the basics. Beyond that, I expect nothing from you, and you should expect nothing from me." Evelina had married Julian 6 months earlier, not out of love but out of necessity. Her father owed a debt so large that it threatened to destroy their family name entirely. The Duke of Ashworth had offered to erase that debt in exchange for a marriage that meant nothing to him beyond convenience. She had accepted, knowing full well what kind of life awaited her. She had not expected kindness. She had not expected warmth. But she had also not expected to be sent away like an unwanted piece of furniture, tucked into a forgotten corner of his vast lands. Now, standing in front of Thornfield, she understood exactly what he thought of her. He believed she would break. He believed that within a month she would come crawling back to Ashworth Manor, begging to be allowed inside the walls of a house that at least had a working roof. He believed this because every person who had ever been sent to Thornfield had left in defeat. Evelina picked up her own bags from the mud. The front door groaned as she pushed it open, and dust rose into the gray light like smoke. Inside, the great hall was littered with broken furniture, cracked tiles, and a staircase missing half its steps. Somewhere above her, water dripped steadily through a hole in the ceiling, striking the floor with a sound like a slow, patient heartbeat. It was as though the house itself was waiting to see what she would do. A woman appeared from a side hallway, wiping her hands on an apron that had seen better decades. She was older, with sharp eyes and gray hair pulled back tightly, and she looked at Evelina the way one might look at a ghost that had wandered in by accident. "You must be the new mistress," the woman said, though there was no warmth in the word mistress. "I am Margaret Hale. I keep what little house there is left to keep." "Evelina Marsh," she replied, then paused. "Ashworth, Evelina Ashworth." Margaret's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Most who come here don't bother correcting themselves. They know which name means something and which one doesn't. Evelina set her bags down carefully, ignoring the sting in the older woman's words. "Is there a room I can use tonight?" "There's a room with most of a roof," Margaret said. "That's the best I can offer you." That night, Evelina lay on a bed with damp sheets, listening to the rain find its way through the cracks above her. She did not cry. She had promised herself long ago that she would not give anyone the satisfaction of her tears, not her father who had sold her future to save his own name, and certainly not a duke who thought a ruined estate was punishment enough to keep her quiet and out of sight. In the morning, she rose before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. She walked through every room of Thornfield, counting the damage with clear, steady eyes. The east wing had lost most of its roof to a storm years earlier. The kitchen still had a working hearth, though the chimney needed repair. The gardens outside had become a wilderness of thorns and weeds, but beneath the tangle she could see the outline of what had once been careful, deliberate rows. An old groundskeeper named Edmund Price found her standing in the overgrown garden that afternoon, staring at the soil as though she could read its history. "You won't find much use in that dirt," he said, leaning on a rake that looked older than he was. "Nothing's grown proper here in 5 years, not since the last owners left it to rot." "Why did they leave?" Evelina asked. Edmund shrugged. "Same reason everyone leaves Thornfield. It takes more than it gives. People come here expecting comfort, and when they don't find it, they run back to wherever they came from." Evelina crouched down and pressed her fingers into the cold soil. It smelled of rain and rot, but underneath that, faintly, it smelled of something else. Something alive, waiting. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Edmund studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she meant it or whether she was simply too proud to admit defeat yet. "You say that now." "I mean it now, and I'll mean it tomorrow," she said, rising to her feet and brushing the dirt from her hands. "Tell me what this land used to grow." He hesitated, surprised by the question, then answered slowly. "Apples, mostly. There was an orchard on the north side that used to feed half the village. Wool, too, before the flocks were sold off. Thornfield used to matter once, before it was left to rot along with everyone who tried to live here." That single sentence stayed with Evelina long after Edmund walked away. Thornfield used to matter. She looked at the broken house behind her, at the wild garden beneath her feet, at the gray sky pressing down over land that everyone else had given up on, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not sadness, not fear, something closer to determination, sharp and clear as a blade. Julian had given her Thornfield to be rid of her, to place her somewhere she would fail quietly and never trouble him again. He believed the estate was a punishment, a slow and certain defeat dressed up as a home. But standing there with mud on her hands and a cold wind pulling at her hair, Evelina began to see something else entirely. She saw a house waiting to be rebuilt. She saw land waiting to be planted. She saw a life waiting to be claimed, not given to her by a husband who wanted nothing to do with her, but built by her own hands, on her own terms. She did not know yet how she would do it. She had little money of her own, no experience managing an estate, and a household staff who expected her to fail just like everyone before her. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty as she stood in that ruined garden. She would not run back to Ashworth Manor. She would not beg for a place in a home where she was never wanted. She would take the broken pieces of Thornfield and build something no one expected her to build. Something that would make every person who had dismissed her regret, ever underestimating what she was capable of. Behind her, the old house stood silent under the gray sky, its broken windows like empty eyes watching her decision take shape. For the first time since she had arrived, Evelina Marsh smiled. "We start tomorrow," she said, turning back toward Margaret, who stood watching from the doorway with an expression caught somewhere between doubt and curiosity. "Tell me everything this house needs, all of it. I want to know what we're working with." Margaret hesitated, then something in her stiff posture softened just slightly. "You truly mean to stay?" "I do." "Then you'd best come inside before the rain starts again," Margaret said, and for the first time since Evelina had arrived, there was the faintest trace of respect in her voice. "There's a great deal to discuss, and not much daylight left to discuss it in." As Evelina followed her into the house, she cast one last look at the wild, thorn-covered garden behind her, and at the orchard she could not yet see but somehow already believed in. Somewhere beneath the neglect and the years of abandonment, Thornfield was still alive, waiting for someone who refused to give up on it. She intended to be exactly that person. The next morning, Evelina rose with the first gray light and walked the grounds of Thornfield with a notebook borrowed from the estate's dusty study. She wrote down every broken window, every collapsed section of fence, every room that needed repair. Margaret Hale walked beside her, arms crossed, watching with an expression that had not yet decided whether to be hopeful or skeptical. "You cannot fix all of this with wishes," Margaret said as they passed the crumbling stable. "Thornfield needs money, and from what I understand, you have very little of your own. I have what my father left me before the marriage, Evelina said. It is not a fortune, but it is enough to begin, and I have something else that matters more than money. And what is that? Time, and people willing to work if they believe the work means something. Margaret said nothing to that, but she did not argue either. Over the following days, Evelina met every person who remained tied to Thornfield. There were only a handful left, tenant farmers whose families had worked the land for generations, now struggling under agreements that favored an absent landlord who had never once visited to see how they lived. She visited a farmer named Harold Bennett first, whose small cottage sat at the edge of the estate's northern boundary. Harold was a broad-shouldered man with weathered hands and a tired look in his eyes, the kind of tired that came from years of working hard for very little return. His wife, Lucy, stood in the doorway with a baby on her hip, watching Evelina with open suspicion. "Another one come to look and leave," Lucy said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of someone who had seen this pattern many times before. "We've had landlords visit before, my lady. They ask questions, they nod, and then nothing changes." "I am not here to ask questions and leave," Evelina said. "I am here to live at Thornfield. This is my home now, whether anyone expected it to be or not." Harold studied her for a long moment. "Forgive me for saying so, but the last 3 owners of this estate said something similar before they packed their things within the year." "Then let me prove myself different from the last 3, Evelina said. "Tell me what has gone wrong here, not what you think I want to hear, the truth." Harold and Lucy exchanged a look, and slowly the truth came out. The rent charged to tenant farmers had increased steadily over the years, while the estate itself provided nothing in return. No repairs to the roads, no support during poor harvests, no investment in the land that made their labor possible. The wool trade that had once supported dozens of families had collapsed when the previous owner sold off the flocks to cover his own debts, leaving the shepherds without work and the weavers without material. Evelina listened to every word, writing details into her notebook, and by the time she left the Bennett cottage, she understood something important. Thornfield was not simply a ruined house. It was a ruined promise, broken slowly over years of neglect, carried by people who had lost faith that anything would change. She spent the following weeks working from sunrise until the candles burned low each night. She reviewed the estate's old records, buried beneath dust in the study, and found detailed accounts from decades earlier when Thornfield had thrived. The orchard on the northern side had once produced enough apples to supply markets 3 villages away. The wool trade had employed nearly every family within a day's walk. The chapel at the heart of the estate had once been the center of community gatherings, weddings, harvest celebrations, and quiet moments of reflection. All of it had crumbled, piece by piece, under years of careless ownership. Evelina began with what she could control immediately. She reduced the tenant rents to a fair and sustainable level, a decision that shocked Margaret and worried Edmund, who warned her that the estate's already thin finances could not withstand less income. "If the tenants cannot feed their families, they cannot work the land," Evelina explained patiently. "A fair arrangement today will build something that lasts. An unfair one only speeds up the collapse that has already begun." Slowly, cautiously, the tenants began to trust her. Harold Bennett was the first to offer real help, bringing 2 of his sons to clear the overgrown orchard on the northern side of the estate. Beneath years of neglect, they found something remarkable. Many of the apple trees, though wild and untamed, had survived. Roots ran deep, deeper than the years of abandonment could destroy. "They just need care," Harold said, running his hand along a gnarled branch heavy with small, hard fruit. "Give them a season, maybe 2, and they'll bear proper apples again." Evelina spent an entire afternoon among those trees, sleeves rolled up, hands blistered from clearing thorns and broken branches, feeling something she had not felt in a very long time: purpose. Word of her efforts spread slowly through the small community surrounding Thornfield. A weaver named Iris Talbot, whose family had once supplied wool cloth to the estate, came to visit out of curiosity more than hope. She found Evelina in the garden, dirt on her dress, directing two farmhands on where to plant new rows of vegetables. "They say the new Duchess works the land herself," Iris said, arms crossed, studying Evelina with open surprise. "I did not believe it until I saw it." "There is no one else to do it," Evelina said simply, wiping sweat from her forehead. "And I would rather work than watch everything fall further into ruin." Iris considered this for a long moment. "My grandmother wove the finest wool cloth in this county, back when Thornfield's flocks still grazed these hills. If you ever manage to rebuild that trade, my family would be glad to weave for you again." It was a small offer, but Evelina recognized it for what it was, the first thread of a community beginning to believe again. Not everyone welcomed the change. A neighboring landowner named Lord Sedgwick, whose estate bordered Thornfield to the east, rode over one afternoon under the excuse of offering welcome, though his true purpose became clear within minutes of conversation. "I must say this is quite the project you have taken on," he said, surveying the half-repaired stable with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "Most would consider Thornfield a lost cause. I certainly did, when I offered to purchase it from the Duke some years ago. He refused, of course, though I imagine he regrets that now, given the state of things." "The estate is not for sale," Evelina said evenly. "No, I suppose it is not," Lord Sedgwick replied, his eyes moving over the grounds with an interest that felt less like curiosity and more like calculation. "Still, if circumstances change, my offer remains open. Restoring a place like this requires resources most people simply do not have." Evelina thanked him for his visit and made no promises, but something about his manner left her uneasy. She mentioned the encounter to Margaret that evening, and the older woman's expression darkened. "Lord Sedgwick has wanted Thornfield's land for years," Margaret said. "It borders his own estate, and rumor says he has long wanted to expand his holdings toward the river. He will not be pleased to see it thriving under someone else's hand." Evelina filed that information away carefully, sensing it might matter more in the future than it did now. Despite the uncertainty, progress continued. Edmund Price, initially doubtful of Evelina's determination, found himself drawn into the work almost against his will. He began repairing the estate's old irrigation channels, long since dried and cracked, restoring water flow to fields that had not been properly farmed in years. He grumbled the entire time about wasted effort and impossible odds, but he showed up every single morning before Evelina herself had risen. The chapel became Evelina's next project. Though its roof had partially collapsed, the stone walls remained solid, and something about the quiet, sacred space called to her. She organized a small group of volunteers, tenant farmers and their families mostly, who worked together clearing debris and repairing the wooden pews inside. It became, in its own quiet way, the first true gathering the Thornfield community had shared in years. One evening, as the volunteers finished their work and prepared to leave, an elderly woman named Constance Fairweather, who had lived near the estate her entire life, approached Evelina with tears in her eyes. "My husband and I were married in this very chapel 50 years ago," Constance said softly, looking up at the newly repaired ceiling beams. "I never thought I would see it standing again." Evelina reached for the older woman's hand. "It will stand for many years still, I promise you that." News of Thornfield's slow revival eventually reached beyond the immediate community. Carried by traveling merchants and curious visitors who had heard whispers of a duchess who worked alongside her tenants rather than above them. A local architect named Nathaniel Cole, intrigued by the stories, arrived one afternoon requesting to see the estate's progress for himself. Nathaniel was a thoughtful, quietly observant man who had spent years restoring old properties throughout the region. He walked the grounds with Evelina for nearly 3 hours, asking detailed questions about the estate's history, examining the structural damage to the manor house with a trained and careful eye. "Most of the damage is repairable," he said finally, standing in what remained of the great hall, studying the exposed beams above them. "It will take time and it will take skill, but the foundation of this house is stronger than people assume. Someone built Thornfield to last centuries, not decades." "Would you be willing to help restore it?" Evelina asked. Nathaniel considered the question carefully before answering. "I would be honored. I have restored many estates in my career, but few with a story as compelling as this one. There is something admirable in refusing to let a place die simply because everyone else has given up on it." With Nathaniel's guidance, the restoration of Thornfield's manor house began in earnest. Evelina worked closely with him, learning about architecture and construction alongside the practical matters of managing tenants and finances. Their partnership grew into an easy friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose, though Evelina made certain never to give Lord Sedgwick or anyone else reason to question her intentions. As the weeks turned into months, Thornfield began to change in ways that were impossible to ignore. The orchard, though still young in its recovery, showed the first signs of a proper harvest. The chapel stood whole again, its bell restored to working order after Edmund spent 2 full weeks repairing the old mechanism. The tenant farms, freed from crushing rents and supported by fair agreements, began producing more than they had in years. Evelina had not yet transformed Thornfield into the thriving estate it once was, but something had shifted in the community surrounding it. Where there had once been resignation and quiet despair, there was now cautious hope, carried forward one repaired fence, one planted row, one restored beam at a time. Word of this transformation had not yet reached Ashworth Manor, where Julian remained entirely unaware of what his discarded wife had built from the ruins he believed would break her. But word was spreading nonetheless, carried through markets and villages, growing louder with each passing week, moving steadily closer to the ears of a duke who had never once imagined he might be wrong about anything. Autumn arrived at Thornfield wrapped in gold and amber, and for the first time in years, the orchard bore true fruit. Evelina stood among the trees on the first morning of the harvest, watching Harold Bennett and his sons fill baskets with apples that were firm, sweet, and plentiful. The sight brought a lump to her throat that she had not expected. "I told you they only needed care," Harold said, grinning as he handed her a bright red apple. "Take a bite. You earned it more than anyone." Evelina bit into the apple, and its sweetness spread across her tongue like a small, quiet victory. Around her, tenant families worked together with a rhythm and energy that had been missing from Thornfield for far too long. Children ran between the trees, laughing as they helped gather fallen fruit. Women carried baskets toward carts bound for the village market. It was the kind of scene Evelina had imagined during her darkest, most exhausted nights, and now it stood before her, real and undeniable. The harvest proved larger than anyone had expected. Within the first week, Thornfield produced enough apples not only to feed its own tenants through the coming winter, but enough surplus to sell at markets in 3 neighboring villages. Evelina worked alongside Nathaniel Cole to establish fair prices and reliable transport, ensuring that the profits returned directly to the people who had done the work rather than disappearing into some distant account. News of the harvest spread quickly. Merchants who had once avoided Thornfield entirely, assuming its produce would be poor or unreliable, began seeking out its apples specifically, drawn by reports of their unusual sweetness. Iris Talbot's family, encouraged by the estate's revival, began restoring the old looms that had sat silent for years, preparing for the day when Thornfield's flocks might once again provide wool worth weaving. That day arrived sooner than expected. With profits from the apple harvest, Evelina purchased a small flock of sheep, carefully chosen for the quality of their wool, and placed them under Edmund's watchful care. He grumbled about the additional work, as he always did, but Evelina noticed him rising even earlier than before, checking on the animals with a devotion that betrayed his true feelings toward the project. The manor house itself transformed steadily under Nathaniel's guidance. The roof of the east wing, once open to the sky, now stood sealed and secure. The great hall, previously littered with broken furniture and cracked tiles, had been cleared, repaired, and polished until the old stone floors gleamed once again. Evelina made a point of preserving as much of the original structure as possible, insisting that Thornfield's history remain visible even as its future took shape. "You have a good eye for this," Nathaniel told her one afternoon as they reviewed plans for restoring the estate's library. "Many people who inherit old properties want to erase everything that came before them. You want to honor it instead." "This house has stood for centuries," Evelina replied, running her fingers along a repaired wooden beam. "It survived neglect, storms, and abandonment. It deserves better than to be stripped of everything that made it what it was." Their working partnership had grown into a genuine friendship, built on long conversations about architecture, history, and the quiet satisfaction of watching something broken slowly become whole again. Nathaniel never overstepped the boundaries of that friendship, and Evelina valued his steady presence more than she had expected to value anyone's company during this strange, difficult chapter of her life. Lord Sedgwick's visits, however, grew more frequent as Thornfield's progress became impossible to ignore. He arrived one afternoon in early winter, uninvited, riding directly into the courtyard where workers were installing new glass windows along the front of the manor house. "The transformation is remarkable," he said, dismounting his horse with practiced ease. "I confess, I did not believe the rumors when I first heard them. A ruined estate, restored by a woman with no experience in managing land or finances. It seemed like nothing more than village gossip." "And now that you have seen it yourself?" Evelina asked, keeping her tone carefully neutral. "Now I find myself curious about your methods," Lord Sedgwick said, his eyes sweeping over the busy courtyard with an expression that mixed genuine interest with something colder underneath. "Tell me, does the Duke know how much his wife has accomplished in his absence?" The question landed with deliberate precision, and Evelina understood immediately that it was not an innocent one. Lord Sedgwick wanted to know whether Julian remained ignorant of Thornfield's revival, and more importantly, he wanted her to know that he was watching, calculating, waiting for an opportunity that had not yet revealed itself. "My husband is aware of my circumstances," Evelina said carefully. "What he chooses to concern himself with is entirely his own decision." Lord Sedgwick smiled, though the smile did not reach his eyes. "Of course. Still, it seems only a matter of time before word reaches him properly. Success has a way of traveling, whether we intend it to or not." After he left, Evelina found herself unsettled by the conversation, though she could not immediately articulate why. She mentioned it to Margaret that evening, and the older woman's expression grew serious. "Lord Sedgwick does not offer friendly warnings," Margaret said, setting down the teapot with more force than necessary. "Whatever he is planning, it will not be in your favor. Mark my words." Evelina considered this warning carefully, but she had little time to dwell on it. Winter brought its own challenges. The newly repaired chapel became the center of a modest Christmas gathering, the first the estate had hosted in over a decade. Tenant families, once distant and distrustful, now filled the pews together, sharing food, music, and stories long into the evening. Constance Fairweather, the elderly woman who had married in that very chapel decades earlier, sang an old hymn in a voice that trembled with age, but carried a warmth that filled the entire room. Evelina stood near the back of the chapel that evening, watching the community she had helped rebuild gather in genuine celebration, and she felt something she had not expected to feel again after her marriage began. She felt at home. The following months brought steady, careful progress. The wool trade, still in its earliest stages, began producing enough material for Iris Talbot's family to weave their first batch of cloth in years. Though modest in quantity, The quality impressed merchants who examined it, and orders began arriving from towns Evelina had never expected to hear from. Nathaniel completed the restoration of the manor house's main structure by early spring, transforming what had once been a collapsing ruin into a home that, while not as grand as Ashworth Manor, carried a warmth and character entirely its own. Visitors who arrived expecting to see the notorious ruin they had heard about instead found themselves standing in a home filled with careful craftsmanship, thriving gardens, and a genuine sense of community that seemed to radiate from every corner of the estate. It was during this period that word of Thornfield's transformation finally began reaching further than the immediate countryside. A traveling merchant, impressed by the quality of the estate's apples and wool, mentioned the story to a contact in the capital, who mentioned it to another, until the tale of the discarded duchess who had restored a ruined estate began circulating among the same social circles that had once dismissed Evelina entirely. Julian Ashworth, deeply occupied with matters of business and politics in the capital, remained largely unaware of these growing rumors for some time. He had sent Evelina to Thornfield with no expectation of ever thinking of her again, and true to that intention, he had not spared her more than a passing thought since her departure. His days were filled with meetings, negotiations, and the endless demands of managing his family's extensive holdings, leaving little room for curiosity about a wife. He considered nothing more than an inconvenient arrangement. That changed one evening at a gathering hosted by a fellow member of the nobility. Julian found himself seated near a group of merchants discussing recent business ventures, and the conversation drifted toward an estate producing remarkably fine apples and wool, an estate whose recovery had become something of a curiosity among those who traded in such goods. "Thornfield, I believe it was called," one merchant said, unaware of the connection to the man seated nearby. "Ruined for years, entirely abandoned, and now producing goods fine enough to rival established estates twice its size. Remarkable turnaround by all accounts." Julian's expression remained composed, but something inside him shifted at the mention of that name. Thornfield, the estate he had given away without a second thought, the one he had chosen specifically because he believed it would drive away a wife he had no interest in keeping close. "Who manages this estate?" Julian asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. The merchant shrugged. "A woman, from what I understand. Some say she is the estate owner's wife, though the details remain unclear. Whoever she is, she has accomplished something quite impressive." Julian said little else during the remainder of the gathering, but the conversation lingered in his mind long after he returned to Ashworth Manor. He found himself, for the first time since sending Evelina away, genuinely curious about what she had built in his absence. Curiosity, however, quickly gave way to something closer to disbelief. Surely the merchant's account had been exaggerated. Surely Thornfield remained the ruin he remembered, and whatever small improvements had been made were nothing more than the natural result of basic upkeep. He told himself this repeatedly over the following weeks, even as similar rumors continued reaching his ears from various sources. A business associate mentioned purchasing wool cloth of exceptional quality from a weaver near Thornfield. A fellow noble commented, almost in passing, that the estate's apple harvest had been the talk of several nearby markets. Each mention chipped away slightly at Julian's certainty that he understood exactly what awaited him if he ever bothered to visit. Meanwhile, at Thornfield, Evelina remained entirely focused on the work in front of her, unaware of the growing curiosity building within Ashworth Manor. She had not expected Julian to notice her efforts, and she had certainly never built Thornfield's revival with the intention of impressing him. Every decision she made, every relationship she built with the tenants and craftsmen around her, came from a genuine desire to build something meaningful, not from any hope of winning back a husband who had made his indifference toward her painfully clear from the very beginning. Still, as spring gave way to early summer, and Thornfield's transformation became increasingly difficult to ignore. Evelina occasionally found herself wondering what Julian would think if he ever saw what she had accomplished. She pushed the thought away each time it surfaced, reminding herself that his opinion mattered little compared to the genuine progress happening around her. The tenant farms thrived under fair agreements. The orchard produced abundant, healthy fruit. The wool trade grew steadily stronger with each passing month. The chapel stood restored, filled regularly with a community that had rediscovered its sense of belonging. Whatever Julian eventually thought of Thornfield's revival, Evelina had already built something far more important than his approval. She had built a home, a genuine community, and a life entirely her own, shaped by her own hands rather than handed to her by a husband who had never once believed she deserved more than a ruined estate and quiet abandonment. But rumors, once they begin traveling, rarely stop on their own. And as summer approached, the whispers surrounding Thornfield's remarkable recovery grew louder, more detailed, and increasingly difficult for Julian Ashworth to dismiss entirely. By midsummer, Julian could no longer dismiss the rumors surrounding Thornfield as simple exaggeration. A land surveyor, hired to assess boundaries near the estate for an unrelated matter, returned to Ashworth Manor with a detailed report that left Julian staring at the papers in genuine disbelief. The surveyor described thriving orchards, healthy livestock, repaired tenant cottages, and a manor house restored with careful, deliberate craftsmanship. None of it matched the ruin Julian remembered sending his wife to nearly a year earlier. He read the report twice, then set it aside, telling himself the surveyor had simply confused Thornfield with some other property. But that explanation grew harder to believe with each subsequent piece of information that reached him. A tax record arrived showing increased revenue from Thornfield's lands, revenue significant enough that his own steward brought it to his attention with visible surprise. "This cannot be accurate," Julian said, examining the figures. "Thornfield has produced nothing of value in years." "The numbers are confirmed, my lord," the steward replied carefully. "It appears the estate has undergone considerable improvement under the current management." Julian set down the papers, feeling an unfamiliar and unwelcome sensation stirring beneath his composed exterior. Curiosity, mixed uncomfortably with something that felt uncomfortably close to guilt. He decided, finally, to see Thornfield for himself. The ride took the better part of a day, and Julian spent much of it convincing himself that whatever he found would surely be a modest improvement at best, nothing worthy of the growing rumors that had reached even the capital. He arrived at Thornfield in the late afternoon, and the sight that greeted him stopped him completely still in his saddle. The house he remembered as a crumbling ruin now stood proud and whole, its stone walls clean, its windows intact and gleaming in the afternoon sun. The overgrown wilderness that had once surrounded the property had been transformed into carefully tended gardens, bursting with color and life. In the distance, he could see rows of fruit trees heavy with fruit, and beyond them, sheep grazing peacefully across green hills that had once been nothing more than neglected wasteland. Julian dismounted slowly, staring at the scene before him with an expression of open disbelief. A young farmhand noticed his arrival and hurried toward the house, calling out to alert the household of an unexpected visitor. Margaret Hale emerged first, and her expression shifted from curiosity to visible shock the moment she recognized the Duke standing in the courtyard. "Your Grace," she said, offering a stiff, hurried curtsy, "we were not expecting your arrival." "Clearly not," Julian said, his eyes still sweeping across the transformed grounds. "Where is my wife?" Margaret hesitated only a moment before answering. "In the orchard, Your Grace, overseeing the harvest." Julian followed the direction Margaret indicated, walking through gardens he did not recognize, past a chapel he remembered as a crumbling ruin, now standing whole with its bell gleaming in the sunlight. He passed tenant cottages in good repair, their gardens neat and productive, and everywhere he looked, He saw evidence of careful, deliberate effort that contradicted everything he had believed about the estate he had so carelessly given away. He found Evelina in the orchard, exactly as Margaret had described, standing among the trees with dirt on her hands and a basket of apples at her feet. She was speaking with Harold Bennett about the timing of the next harvest, her expression animated and focused, entirely unaware of Julian's approach. He stopped several paces away, watching her for a long moment before she noticed him. When she finally turned and saw him standing there, her expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession: surprise, wariness, and something that looked almost like quiet defiance. "Julian," she said, straightening and brushing dirt from her hands, "I did not expect you." "Clearly," he replied, his eyes moving across the orchard around them. "This is not what I left behind." "No," Evelina agreed evenly, "it is not." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of the orchard around them, birds calling overhead, the distant bleating of sheep, the rustle of leaves in a gentle summer breeze. Julian found himself struggling to reconcile the woman standing before him with the memory he had carried since sending her away, a woman he had dismissed as an inconvenience, unworthy of his time or attention. "I heard rumors," Julian said finally. "I did not believe them. And now I am standing in an orchard that should not exist, on land I gave away specifically because I believed it was worthless," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine confusion. "I do not understand how you accomplished this." Evelina met his gaze steadily. "I did not accomplish it alone. The tenants, the craftsmen, the community around Thornfield, they built this alongside me. You sent me here believing I would fail quietly and disappear from your concern. Instead, I chose to build something real." Julian said nothing for a long moment, absorbing the weight of her words. He had expected, at most, to find Thornfield slightly improved, perhaps enough to explain the rumors he had heard. He had not expected to find an entire thriving community, built from nothing by a woman he had underestimated so completely. "Show me," he said finally, "all of it." For the remainder of the afternoon, Evelina walked Julian through every corner of Thornfield's transformation. She showed him the restored manor house, explaining Nathaniel's careful attention to preserving its original character. She introduced him to Harold and Lucy Bennett, whose farm had become one of the estate's most productive. She brought him to the chapel, where Constance Fairweather happened to be arranging flowers near the altar, and watched as Julian listened, genuinely engaged, as the elderly woman spoke of her wedding decades earlier and her joy at seeing the chapel restored. Throughout the tour, Julian remained largely quiet, absorbing details with an expression that shifted gradually from disbelief to something closer to genuine respect. By the time they reached the hillside where Thornfield's small flock of sheep grazed peacefully in the golden evening light, he seemed to have run out of ways to dismiss what stood before him. "I misjudged you," he said finally, watching the sheep move across the hillside. "I sent you here expecting failure, and instead you built something I could not have imagined." "You sent me here to be rid of me," Evelina said plainly, no bitterness in her voice, only clear, honest truth. "I understood that from the beginning. I did not build this to prove anything to you. I built it because I refused to let a broken place, and by extension myself, simply be discarded." Julian turned to look at her fully, and something in his expression shifted, softened, revealing a vulnerability she had not seen from him before. "I did discard you. I will not pretend otherwise. It was unkind, and I did not think of the consequences to you when I made that decision." Evelina studied him carefully, unsure what to make of this unexpected honesty. "Why come now? Why not simply continue ignoring Thornfield, as you clearly intended when you gave it to me?" "Because I could not stop thinking about it," Julian admitted. "The rumors grew too persistent to dismiss, and I found myself curious about what kind of person could accomplish what everyone described. I did not expect to find you so thoroughly transformed as well." "I have not transformed," Evelina said. "I have simply had the opportunity to become fully myself, something my circumstances never allowed before." They stood together in silence for a long moment, watching the sun begin its slow descent behind the hills. Julian's presence at Thornfield had not been part of any plan Evelina had crafted, but as the evening light stretched long shadows across the ground she had rebuilt with her own hands, she felt no fear at his arrival. Whatever Julian decided to do with the knowledge of what she had accomplished, she knew, with absolute certainty, that Thornfield belonged to her now, not simply on paper, but in every meaningful sense that mattered. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hooves approaching along the estate's main road. Both turned to see Lord Sedgwick riding toward them, his expression carrying an unmistakable satisfaction that immediately put Evelina on alert. "Your Grace," Lord Sedgwick called out, dismounting with practiced ease. "What a fortunate coincidence, finding you here. I have been meaning to discuss a matter of some urgency regarding Thornfield's finances, a matter I believe you will find quite interesting." Julian's expression grew guarded as Lord Sedgwick approached, and Evelina felt a familiar unease settle over her. The same instinct that had warned her weeks earlier that this man's interest in Thornfield carried motives far darker than simple curiosity. "What matter would that be?" Julian asked, his tone carefully neutral. Lord Sedgwick smiled, the expression carrying none of the warmth it pretended to convey. "Perhaps we should discuss it somewhere more private, Your Grace. I believe what I have to share may change your perspective on your wife's remarkable achievements rather significantly." Evelina felt her stomach tighten with apprehension as Julian's gaze shifted between her and Lord Sedgwick, uncertainty flickering across his features for the first time since his arrival at Thornfield. Whatever Lord Sedgwick intended to reveal, she understood immediately that it would test everything she had built, and everything Julian had only just begun to understand about the wife he had so carelessly discarded. Julian studied Lord Sedgwick for a long moment before responding. "Whatever you have to say, you may say it here. My wife is the one who manages Thornfield. She should hear it as well." Lord Sedgwick's confident expression faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly. "Very well, Your Grace, if you insist. I have come across certain records suggesting that the improvements made to Thornfield were financed through funds obtained under questionable circumstances. Debts, perhaps, taken on without your knowledge or consent, secured against an estate that technically remains under your name." Evelina felt a flash of alarm, though she kept her expression carefully composed. She had never taken on debt to fund Thornfield's restoration, relying instead on careful budgeting, fair reinvestment of the estate's own growing profits, and the goodwill of tenants and craftsmen willing to work toward a shared vision. She suspected immediately what Lord Sedgwick was attempting, an effort to plant doubt in Julian's mind, to undermine everything she had built through insinuation rather than fact. "That is not true," Evelina said firmly. "Every improvement made to Thornfield has been funded through the estate's own recovering income, along with modest personal funds I brought into this marriage. There is no hidden debt, no questionable arrangement of any kind." "Perhaps you are unaware of arrangements made on your behalf," Lord Sedgwick suggested smoothly, though his eyes carried a calculating edge that betrayed his true intentions. "I have documents suggesting otherwise, documents I would be happy to share with the Duke privately." "Then share them now," Julian said, his voice carrying an edge Evelina had not heard from him before. "If such documents exist, I see no reason for privacy." Lord Sedgwick hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Julian's directness. "I do not have them on my person at this moment, Your Grace. I merely wish to bring the matter to your attention, given my long-standing interest in Thornfield's welfare as a neighboring landowner." "Your interest in Thornfield has never been about its welfare," Evelina said, stepping forward with steady resolve. "You have wanted this land for years, ever since your own estate expanded toward the river. You approached me shortly after my arrival, offering to purchase Thornfield, an offer I declined. Since then, you have watched this estate's recovery with growing dissatisfaction, and now that recovery threatens whatever plans you once had for acquiring this land through the Duke's indifference. Lord Sedgwick's composure cracked slightly at the accusation, a flicker of genuine anger passing across his features before he mastered his expression once more. These are serious accusations, my lady, made without any real evidence. Then produce your documents, Julian said flatly. If genuine concerns exist regarding my wife's management of this estate, I will examine them thoroughly. But I will not entertain vague insinuations designed to create doubt without substance behind them. The tension between the three of them stretched taut in the fatting evening light. Lord Sedgwick appeared to weigh his options carefully, clearly recognizing that his attempt to undermine Evelina's credibility had failed to achieve its intended effect. "Very well," he said finally, his tone considerably cooler than before. "I will not trouble you further this evening. Should genuine concerns arise regarding Thornfield's finances, I am certain they will surface in due time, with or without my involvement." He mounted his horse and rode away without further ceremony, leaving Julian and Evelina standing together in the settling darkness of early evening. "He lied," Evelina said once Lord Sedgwick had disappeared from view. "There are no debts, no questionable arrangements. He wanted to plant doubt, hoping you would distrust my management enough to consider selling Thornfield after all." "I gathered as much," Julian said, his expression thoughtful. His manner did not carry the confidence of a man with genuine evidence. It carried the confidence of a man attempting to manufacture a crisis where none exists. Evelina studied him carefully, surprised by how quickly he had seen through Lord Sedgwick's attempt at manipulation. "You believe me, then?" "I have walked this estate for hours," Julian said. "I have seen the accounts, spoken with your tenants, witnessed the genuine transformation you built through honest, careful work. Lord Sedgwick's accusations do not match anything I have observed with my own eyes." Over the following days, Julian remained at Thornfield, reviewing the estate's financial records personally, speaking further with tenants and craftsmen who confirmed everything Evelina had told him. He examined every transaction, every agreement, every careful decision she had made since her arrival, and found nothing but honest, thoughtful management behind Thornfield's remarkable recovery. Lord Sedgwick, true to his earlier threat, attempted to spread rumors of financial misconduct throughout the surrounding region, hoping to damage Evelina's reputation and create enough uncertainty that Julian might reconsider his wife's management of the estate. But the tenants and craftsmen who had witnessed Thornfield's transformation firsthand refused to give credibility to accusations that contradicted everything they had experienced. Harold Bennett, when approached by a merchant repeating Lord Sedgwick's claims, dismissed the rumor immediately. "I have worked this land under Lady Ashworth's management for nearly a year," he said firmly. "Every agreement has been fair, every payment honest. Whatever Lord Sedgwick claims, it does not match the truth I have lived." Similar responses echoed throughout the community, and within weeks, Lord Sedgwick's attempt to undermine Thornfield's success had failed entirely, leaving his own reputation somewhat tarnished by the transparent nature of his scheme. As the immediate crisis passed, Julian found himself remaining at Thornfield longer than he had originally intended. He worked alongside Evelina, learning the details of estate management he had never bothered to understand at Ashworth Manor, where stewards and advisors had always handled such matters on his behalf. He walked the orchards with Harold, observed the wool trade's careful revival with Iris Talbot, and spent long evenings discussing architecture and restoration with Nathaniel Cole, whose respect for Evelina's vision matched his own growing admiration. One evening, as they stood together in the restored chapel, watching the last light of sunset filter through newly repaired windows, Julian spoke with a sincerity Evelina had not expected from him. "I came here believing I would find confirmation of my own indifference," he said quietly. "Instead, I found a wife who built something extraordinary from nothing, who earned the genuine respect and loyalty of an entire community, who accomplished all of this despite my complete failure to see her worth from the very beginning." "I did not build this for your approval," Evelina said, though her tone carried no bitterness, only honest clarity. "I built it because I refused to be discarded without a fight." "I understand that now," Julian said. "And I am asking, not commanding, whether you would consider a genuine partnership between us, in managing our combined estates, and in whatever marriage we choose to build moving forward. I have no right to expect forgiveness for how I treated you, but I hope, in time, we might build something honest together." Evelina considered his words carefully, weighing them against everything she had learned about herself during her time at Thornfield. She had built a life entirely her own, discovered strength and capability she had never been given the opportunity to explore, and earned the genuine respect of a community that had once dismissed her as thoroughly as Julian had. Whatever partnership they built moving forward would need to honor everything she had become, not simply return her to the role of quiet, dismissed wife she had occupied before. "I will consider it," she said finally. "But any partnership between us must be built on equal respect, not obligation. I will not return to being someone easily discarded whenever convenient." "I would not ask that of you," Julian said. "I have seen what you are capable of. I would be a fool to want anything less than your full partnership in every sense that matters." In the months that followed, Thornfield continued its remarkable growth, its reputation spreading throughout the region as one of the finest managed estates in the county. The orchard produced its largest harvest yet. The wool trade expanded to supply merchants from towns Evelina had never expected to reach, and the chapel remained the heart of a community that had rediscovered its sense of belonging and purpose. Julian divided his time between Ashworth Manor and Thornfield, gradually integrating the management practices Evelina had pioneered into his broader holdings, recognizing the wisdom in fair tenant agreements and genuine investment in the communities that sustained his family's wealth. Their partnership, built slowly and carefully on newfound mutual respect, grew into something neither had expected when their marriage first began under such difficult circumstances. Lord Sedgwick, his scheme thoroughly exposed and his reputation damaged by the transparent nature of his attempted manipulation, eventually ceased his interest in acquiring Thornfield's land, recognizing that the estate's success had grown far beyond anything he could hope to undermine or claim for himself. Evelina remained, above all else, the true architect of Thornfield's transformation, respected not simply as the Duke's wife, but as the woman who had taken a ruined, forgotten estate and built it into something the entire region admired. Tenants who had once doubted her intentions now spoke of her with genuine loyalty and affection. Craftsmen and merchants who had initially dismissed the rumors of her success now sought her guidance and partnership. The community that had gathered so hesitantly in that first restored chapel service now celebrated together regularly, bound by a shared history of rebuilding something everyone else had believed was beyond saving. Standing once more in the orchard where her journey at Thornfield had truly begun, Evelina looked out across the thriving estate she had built with her own hands, her own resolve, and the trust of a community that had chosen to believe in her when few others would. She had arrived at Thornfield as a woman discarded, sent away to be forgotten, quietly expected to fail and disappear from consideration entirely. She stood there now as its rightful mistress, respected in her own right, having proven, beyond any doubt, that what one person considers ruined, another can transform into something the whole world eventually comes to want.